My name is Gavin Evans, and this is my review of Last Night in Soho. Now, if you know me, you know that I've been super excited to see this movie. Like, it was my most anticipated movie of 2020 and 2021, and that's mainly due to the fact that it's directed by Edgar Wright, who is my favorite director. He's got a style unlike anyone else, and the use of editing in his movies and the use of music in his movies is just masterful. I love The World's End, I loved Baby Driver, I loved Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, I loved Hot Fuzz, I loved Shaun of the Dead. He's been 5 for 5 in my book, and I couldn't wait to see what he would do with the whole genre. And I have to say, with the very opening shot of this movie, I thought I was going to love it. Like, the very first shot that this movie begins on is just such an Edgar Wright shot that I absolutely love. And I will say that the visuals of this movie are absolutely the standout. The use of neon lighting throughout just gives this movie a unique feel, unlike any other horror movie. He also does some really creative stuff with the camera, and there's a few moments where there's two actresses alternating, and just the way he's able to capture that in such a smooth, flawless way is incredibly impressive. And just like every other Edgar Wright movie, this soundtrack is absolutely phenomenal. Like, while I was watching this movie, I had my phone on the couch and just constantly Shazam, 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 Shazam. It was just that good of a soundtrack. It really gave this movie a unique identity that I really loved about it. And there's some moments where he just tones up the volume and the sound and just everything going on. It's so overwhelming and you just get anxious and you get uncomfortable, and it's really well directed in those moments. And one thing I loved about the plot of this movie is that the main character, whenever she falls asleep in this bed, she goes back in time to the 60s. And whenever she goes back to the 60s, back in the 60s, I was in a very famous TV show. Joke, if you get it, you get it. If you don't, then you don't. But anyways, whenever she goes back to the 60s, it gets darker and darker as the movie progresses. And that adds a certain Nightmare on Elm Street quality to it that I really loved, because this character doesn't want to fall asleep. She doesn't want to go home. She doesn't want to lie in that bed. She doesn't know what will happen if she does. And you just feel helpless for the main character, because where else is she going to sleep? What else is she going to do? She can't stay up all the time. So I just love that quality of the movie, and I do love it when we start to see the past and the present merge and it becomes one more throughout as the movie progresses. I love that element of it. But you knew it was coming. There's always a but. This movie was a massive disappointment. It brings me no joy in saying this, but I did not like this movie. This is easily Edgar Wright's worst movie, and I think the most frustrating element to it is that everything I just said was all true. You can see the potential with this movie, especially the first act and how it establishes the characters, the setting, and just everything. You can see a really fantastic movie here, but it all falls apart around the 45-minute mark. Which I know isn't popular to say, because lots of people said that they absolutely loved the first 2 acts of this movie, but it falls apart in the last act. But for me, it fell apart after the first act, and here's the main reason why. Because the character goes back in time and she has a wonderful night. It is the most magical night of her life. Like, she wants to become Anya Taylor-Joy's character. She starts trying to look like her and act like her, and I love that aspect of the movie. And then she goes back there the second night, which happens very shortly after the first night. And she has a decent night, not as good as the first. She gets up and sings, and not much else happens. But then in the third night she goes back in time, which is still within the first act of this movie. It gets darker and darker, and the moment where it becomes dark is really effective and really well done. But then it's just like, well, now we've got 2 acts of the movie left, and where else is there to go? And it doesn't feel like the movie evolves after that first shift in tone. And because of that, the movie feels really redundant and repetitive throughout, and it just loses steam instantly. Edgar Wright is known for making these fast-paced movies, but this movie dragged. Like, hear me out, I think this movie should have been structured like Coraline. Yes, that movie, I love it. It's one of my favorites. It's such a flawless movie in my opinion. And I love the way that movie is structured because Coraline goes to this house, she goes to the other ward. The first night is absolutely wonderful and she spends time there. We get to know these versions of those characters. And then she goes back again and we get to see other characters. And you just understand the appeal behind it all. And then when she goes there the third time, that's when things get dark and she kind of gets stuck there. And there's lots of similarities between this movie and Coraline, and I'm glad this movie didn't try to copy another movie beat for beat, but I think structurally and pacing wise it should have stayed closer to Coraline and actually establish the other world, or in this case the 60s. Because yes, we go back to the 60s a few times in this movie, but it never feels established. It feels like we spend time there, but it doesn't feel like we get to know it at all. Like, we see this Untitled Joy character, and not once did I have a clear idea of who this person was. All I knew is it was this perfect version of who she wanted to be. Like, I didn't really get a sense of who any of these characters were in the other world. Anya Taylor-Joy's character is a blank slate. I love Anya Taylor-Joy as an actress. She's an absolutely fantastic actress. She should have won an Oscar for The Witch. She should have won an Emmy for The Queen's Gambit. She was so good in that show. But I feel like she's completely wasted here because she's given nothing to do. There's nothing to her character besides being the victim. And then we've got Matt Smith's character, which is incredibly bland too. And then there's a romance that develops between the two of them, but it just happens like that, and I had zero investment in it. Because the first night, they're trying so hard to make it be the perfect night. But they forgot to establish any characters or relationships, and because it happened so fast, I couldn't have cared less. If the first night was like 15-20 minutes, and we had these characters talking, and just develop them further and actually give them a personality, I would be more on board. But we didn't get that. So I didn't really care about anything that happened back then, and because so much of the movie is dependent on that for our main character's growth and what she goes through, I couldn't connect to her because I couldn't connect to the past. And another thing about this movie is that it's trying to be about two things. The first one is about how the grass is always greener on the other side. This movie isn't about nostalgia if you ask me. I know lots of people are saying that, but not once is the main character actually nostalgic for the 60s. She wasn't around then. No, she's not happy where she is. She feels like she doesn't belong. She feels like she's an old soul and she wishes she existed at a different point in time. And then she gets to see that time and how it really was, and she realizes that she doesn't. I don't think that's nostalgia. And I just wish they explored that a bit more, because then the movie also focuses on the sexualization and the exploitation of female stars in the past. And it's a bit in your face in your moments, especially one scene involving a taxi driver. But then the direction the movie ends up taking for the last act kind of spits in the face of that idea. And by the end, the message just gets blurred and it just becomes a really messy movie and what it's trying to communicate, what it's trying to say. And I just don't think it explores either scene really all that well. And speaking of the last act, it didn't work for me whatsoever. I thought it was really bad. There was a few twists and turns and I didn't like any of them. The longer this movie goes on for, the more we find out, the more it loses me. I can see what it's going for, but the execution of it is terrible. But back to some positives. Thomasin McKenzie is really good in this movie. She was great in Leave No Trace and Jojo Rabbit, and she's good here, so I look forward to see what she does next. Like I said, Anya Taylor-Joy, I love her, and I don't think she's bad in this movie, I just don't think she's given anything to work with. Terrence Stamp is in this movie, and all I'll say is that I hated everything about his character. It is some very lazy screenwriting there, and I won't give anything away, but I didn't like what they did with him. And then we've also got this boyfriend character named John, and I don't like this guy at all, mainly to the fact that he wasn't grounded in reality whatsoever. Like, he's the overly supportive boyfriend character, but he doesn't even know the main character, and he's witnessing her doing all this crazy stuff, and he's still by her side, and I just didn't buy it. If these two had a longer relationship or something, maybe I could. But the execution of that relationship didn't work for me at all. Look, I really want to love this movie, and I think there's a great movie here. Like, if they developed the characters in the 60s and they took their time, I really do think this movie could have been really special. If we've got the main character, she goes back to the 60s, and then she comes back and she starts doing her hair like Anya Taylor-Joy, and she starts trying to dress like her, and she can't wait to go back, and then she goes back, and it's another amazing night. And then maybe in the real world, she starts seeing Anya Taylor-Joy in the mirror. Kind of like how she sees herself in the mirror when she's Anya Taylor-Joy. And she starts losing control of herself in the real world. And the past and the present are starting to become one. Or, if they just go what they were, the more Coraline approach, well, she starts going to the past, it becomes darker and darker, and then all of a sudden she can't get out, and it's this horrific nightmare. That would have been really great. But the movie doesn't do either of those. In fact, what we get instead is just a very poor movie that I just found lacking, and it breaks my heart to say that. It really does. Like I said, there is some good filmmaking on display. The soundtrack is phenomenal. Thomas and Mackenzie is really good. But the ideas this movie is trying to explore and the execution of them is really bad. The story's a mess. It's not paced properly. Lots of the characters aren't even remotely developed. And for a horror movie, this movie isn't even remotely scary. I was hoping for a bit more atmosphere and tension and suspense. And there's a couple moments where you get the uncomfortable feeling, but not enough to really justify it as a whole movie. So I'm going to go ahead and give Last Night in Soho a 4.5 out of 10. Yeah, this disappointment really hurt me. It did. I'm not happy about this movie not being good. But have you seen Last Night in Soho? What did you think about it? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you like, make sure you comment, make sure you subscribe. Stay tuned for some more videos soon. And Gavin,